U.S.-banked financier Exim Bank of the United States has handed Kenya's Treasury a default notice for delayed payment of a 57.8 billion Kenyan shillings loan that the government guaranteed for Kenya Airways, or KQ. The default notice comes after the airline failed to remain up to date with payments for the loan. KQ defaulted on part of its $64.6 billion Kenyan shillings loan, or about $525 million loan from the Private Export Funding Corporation of the United States, PEFCO, guaranteed by the Exim Bank of the U.S., which in turn was guaranteed by the government of Kenya. The airline, which has been surviving on state bailout since COVID-19, reported a 9.8 billion shillings loss in August 2022, a better performance than the 11.48 billion shillings loss that it recorded in the same period a year earlier. Joining me now is aviation expert Sean Mendis as we look at KQ's latest problem. Sean, we talked about Kenya Airways at the end of last year, at the beginning of this year, and now we're back here again with a default notice going to the ministry, the Treasury, because of that loan. This is a 12-year loan facility. So what was really the purpose of this 64.6 billion shilling loan that the company took, that the airline and the government took from PEFCO?
Well, the roots of this loan actually go back into the early 2010s when Kenya Airways was procuring a bunch of aircraft from Boeing. And, you know, as is normal in these kind of deals, there is a financing bridge put in place by the US Exim Bank, and in this case, through one of their subsidiaries, which is the Private Asset Financing Corporation. And, you know, that was then to be repaid by Kenya Airways over a 10 to 12-year period, I understand. Now, the problem, of course, which we all know, is that Kenya Airways has not been profitable since 2012. And as a result of that, you know, they've not been able to keep up with the payment. Well, they were able to keep up with the payments until COVID hit, which put a significant more problems on their cash flow. And as a result of that, in 2022, the government of Kenya, which was the controlling shareholder of Kenya Airways, agreed to novate the guarantees on the loan and would take over the responsibility of paying down this loan to US Exim, while then the government would in turn create a new subsidiary loan agreement with Kenya Airways. So basically, the government would then agree to pay off the US lenders, and Kenya Airways would then repay that money to the government on different terms. Unfortunately, the problem right now is that the government of Kenya is struggling to be able to make those payments to US Exim Bank, and as a result, it's actually the government of Kenya which has been served with the default notice. The loan was novated from Kenya Airways to the government of Kenya last year. In fact, I think we even had a discussion of that sometime in the last quarter of last year.
So it's easy for us to focus on KQ's issues from COVID-19 down, but in all honesty, they supersede that, or they precede that, because this is a company that's been in the red since 2012. That's the last time the company actually made some form of profits, and they've received multi-billion shilling state bailouts to also maintain operations. So why has KQ struggled basically over the past decade, even before COVID, before the Russia-Ukraine crisis added and piled up on top of the economic issues of many of African economies? So what was the struggle that KQ has been facing for the past decade now?
Well, you know, KQ's problems come down to, well, to pretty much one thing at its center, and that is what they used to call Project Mawingu. That was a very ambitious growth plan that their former CEO, Titus Naikuni, had put in place towards the end of the 2000s, early 2010s. And Project Mawingu was intended to basically add a lot of aircraft to Kenya Airways fleet and to grow the number of destinations to, I think it was over 50 African destinations. And a lot of growth was forecast. The unfortunate problem was that they were going to fund a lot of this growth via debt, which obviously meant that they had very little wiggle room in terms of not being able to implement the plan the way they wanted to. And they launched it at absolutely the worst time, because right after they began to take on this debt, we saw security issues in Kenya and Eastern Africa due to the Somalia problems, which caused a huge drop in tourist traffic into Kenya. We saw the Ebola issues in wider Africa, which again saw a drop in intra-African traffic that KQ was so dependent upon. They wound up with a bunch of very large aircraft like Boeing 777-300ER, which they simply could not fill. They had to try and pass those aircraft off on lease or sale to other carriers, often at losses, just to be able to cut their own losses and refocus their fleet on, primarily flying within Africa with smaller planes. But that debt has not yet gone away. And that debt from Project Mawingu, which is now well over a decade old in some cases, is what is still dragging Kenya Airways down today.
Okay, so this is what we know so far. So Kenya's Treasury guaranteed the loan to KQ at an exchange rate of 84 shillings to a dollar. But right now the exchange rate currently stands at 125 shillings to the dollar. Now there is an outstanding balance of 57.77 billion Kenyan shillings, around $462 million. So take us through this default notice for the government. As you said, it goes straight to the Kenyan government now because they guaranteed the loan. Is it a demand for full payments? Because that can be made if the insurer does not believe that the party has the ability to pay. So right now, the U.S. Exim Bank can demand full repayment, or do we believe it's going to be a partial repayment, or even some way working through the terms between the Kenyan government and the U.S. Exim Bank? What do you think?
Well, I think, we've only received limited media reports on this. The U.S. Exim Bank and the Kenyan government don't, put out press releases giving the details of this. So, there's a lot of speculation around this. However, from my experience dealing with things like this, everything is open for negotiation. I think there is a long-standing relationship between Kenya and the United States. The United States obviously has been looking to strengthen that relationship based upon President trip to the US recently and so forth. So I think there's definitely going to be a lot of wiggle room. The US Exim Bank obviously is wholly owned by the US government. So while they're not going to do any loan forgiveness, they will definitely be looking at the willingness to negotiate with the Kenyan side in terms of what they can do to make this debt more manageable. However, issues such as the exchange rate are always going to be risks for any African borrowers who borrow in foreign currencies. The exchange rates are volatile. The exchange rates are often volatile for reasons out of the control of the borrower. But when you take on debt in a currency other than what the majority of your revenues are, that is just an additional risk that you're assuming.
All right, so you mentioned the president now. So in December, President William Ruto met top executives of Delta Airlines, which is the largest U.S. carrier by market value. And on his American trip, he launched the government bid to sell its entire 48.9% stake in Kenya Airways. And Kenya is seeking a cash flush foreign airline as a strategic investor in the national carrier to offer expertise and also cut its reliance on Treasury handouts for operational cash. You can see what the president said there. He says, I'm willing to sell the whole of Kenya Airways PLC. I'm not in the business of running an airline that just has a Kenyan flag. That's not my business. So we can see that he's really looking to divest, not just his government, but possibly, Kenya overall. And there were plans initially about a year or so ago to even nationalize the airline. Those were sat down in 2022. We're now at the point where the government is saying 48.9%, please come and take it. So let's look at who could be a viable business option or viable business partner for Kenya Airways. The preliminary talks with Delta, it doesn't mean it's going to be Delta. What do you think?
Well, I think it's almost certain that you're not going to have Delta come in with a 48.9% stake. I think it's interesting though that the government of Kenya is willing to sell, because unfortunately it doesn't seem that many people are willing to buy. And I think a big reason for that is the fact that Kenya Airways, as it stands today, is basically an insolvent entity. It has debts that far exceed the value of its assets. And as a result, until something is done with these debts, which are in the range of $800 million plus, there's no commercial entity that is going to be willing to come in and assume that kind of debt of a loss-making entity. And, Delta is run as a very well-run business. I think Delta definitely has an interest of getting more involved in the African markets, and a lot of steps that they've taken in recent years, including, supposedly coming together with a closer partnership with Ethiopia. In fact, Delta has hired Ethiopian Airlines' former CEO, Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun, as one of their strategic advisors for their Africa strategy. So I think Delta is definitely looking at getting involved in more in Africa. They see that as a market where they've been for almost 20 years now, and need to grow their position in that market. I'm not quite sure that that's going to involve taking a 49% stake in Kenya Airways. I definitely think that both Delta and Kenya Airways will work more closely together, as they're both part of the SkyTeam Alliance. And they both have a strong history of working together with KLM Air France, which still remain a minority shareholder in Kenya Airways, and of course have a very large joint venture agreement with Delta Airlines. But it's going to be tricky for Kenya to be able to find someone willing to take a stake in Kenya Airways unless they're willing to firewall or pay down that debt themselves. That's just the reality.
All right, finally, Sean, before I let you go, what really are the options? Even if the conversation around buying a stake or taking all of a stake, that's going to take some time. And we know that government has said that they don't want to be paying any more bailouts or any more debt by the end of December this year. So what options are left? We have a debt of about 102.7 billion Kenyan shillings, around $835 million. And the debts include loans, letter of credit facilities, all of it convertible equity amounts as well, about 688 million of that guaranteed by the government of Kenya. So what options really are left so that we're not simply seeing a drain on government finances and taxpayers' money?
Well, I think you've got three options pretty much. One is pretty much unacceptable, which is to just keep funding it and throwing good money after bad without any restructuring or similar. And I think while past governments had, if not explicitly, at least implicitly signaled that they'd be willing to do that, I think that this government has made it clear that that is not going to be among their policies, so you could pretty much exclude that. The second one is one that we've already discussed, which is in terms of selling it to a willing buyer, willing to take on the airline warts and all. As we discussed, that's not something that's going to be easy to find a buyer because that the company has. The third one is find a way of firewalling that debt, find a way of paying down that debt, whether that's going to be through refinancing it, outside of the government assuming it, or whatever means that takes. Kenya Airways, from my discussions with people at KQ in recent months, is actually being able to, if not break even, but coming very close to being able to break even on its operational issues right now. They've done a lot of restructuring of the airline post-COVID. They've gotten rid of expensive aircraft leases. They've renegotiated a lot of terms. They've been able to, if not solve, but at least pacify some of the labor issues. So, if the airline had a clean balance sheet today, I think it could definitely be competitive, if not necessarily profitable on day one. So I think the solution is going to have to be some sort of way of ridding the airline of its debt, if it's going to be able to really be able to realize its potential. But of course, that's an 800 and something $million question of how they're going to achieve that.
All right, Sean, thank you so much as always. We'll be keeping an eye on how things play out with KQ, because it is, of course, or it was at one point one of Africa's most premier airlines, and many people continue to want to see it take to the skies with just a little less baggage at this point in time. Thank you so much, Sean.
Thank you.